What if I told you that France's greatest war hero, the man who fought alongside Joan of Arc to save the entire kingdom, was simultaneously committing acts so unspeakably evil that they would haunt Europe for centuries? What if the very same hands that raised the banner of victory at Orleans were also responsible for the disappearance of hundreds of innocent souls? The truth about Gilles de Rais is so disturbing, so unthinkable, that historians still struggle to reconcile how one man could embody both ultimate heroism and absolute evil. This isn't just the story of a fall from grace. This is the story of how history's most trusted savior was actually history's most depraved predator, hiding in plain sight while an entire kingdom celebrated his name. And the most chilling part, he almost got away with it completely. Chapter 1. The Golden Facade. In the year 1429, as English armies crushed French hopes across the countryside, one name echoed through every village, every castle, every prayer whispered in the dark. Gilles de Rais, the Golden Knight of Brittany. At just 25 years old, he had already achieved what most nobles could only dream of in a lifetime. Marshal of France, the youngest ever appointed to such a position, wealthier than princes, commanding more castles than some kings, and bearing a reputation so pristine it seemed almost supernatural. But it wasn't his wealth or his titles that made Gilles de Rais legendary. It was his unwavering loyalty to a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints. When Joan of Arc appeared at the French court with her impossible mission to crown the Dauphin and drive out the English, most nobles laughed. Others plotted. But Gilles de Rais knelt before her and pledged his sword, his fortune, and his life to her cause. History records their partnership as one of the most extraordinary military alliances ever forged. At the siege of Orleans, while seasoned commanders hesitated, Gilles charged alongside Joan into impossible odds. When she was wounded by an English arrow, it was Gilles who carried her from the battlefield. When French morale crumbled, it was his golden banner flying beside her sacred standard that rallied the troops. Together, they didn't just win battles, they performed miracles. The chronicles of the time paint him as the perfect medieval knight. Brave beyond question, noble in bearing, generous to his vassals, and deeply devout in his faith. Witnesses described him as tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to burn with righteous purpose. He funded his own armies, equipped his own soldiers, and never asked for payment or reward. He fought not for glory or gold, but for God, for France, and for the miraculous maiden who had captured his complete devotion. But even in those golden days, there were whispers. Servants noticed that their master could be intense. His devotion to Joan bordered on obsession. His generosity sometimes carried strange undertones. His prayers in his private chapel went on for hours, and sometimes the words he spoke weren't in Latin or French, but in languages no one recognized. These were small things, easily dismissed. After all, great men often had their peculiarities. As 1429 turned to 1430, Gilles de Rais stood at the absolute pinnacle of medieval society. The Dauphin had been crowned King Charles VII, the English were in retreat, and France was saved. Joan of Arc was beloved as a saint, and Gilles de Rais was celebrated as her most faithful champion. At royal banquets, nobles competed to sit near him. Ladies of the court considered it an honor to dance with him. Priests blessed him as God's own warrior. He was everything the medieval world admired: powerful, wealthy, successful, and seemingly blessed by divine favor. The Golden Knight of Brittany appeared to have achieved perfection itself, but perfection, as history would soon discover, can hide the most terrifying secrets. And in the stone chambers beneath his magnificent castles, something was already stirring in the darkness, something hungry, something that would soon reveal the true face behind the golden mask. The savior of France was about to become something far worse than any enemy they had ever faced in battle. Chapter 2. The Crack in the Soul. May 30th, 1431, the market square in Rouen. Gilles de Rais stood among the crowd of nobles, watching as the flames consumed the only person he had ever truly worshipped. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the miracle worker who had saved France, was burning alive as an accused heretic, and there was nothing the Golden Knight could do to save her. The English had captured Joan nearly a year earlier, and despite all of Gilles' wealth, all his political connections, all his military might, he had been powerless to prevent this moment. He watched as the woman who had changed the course of history writhed in agony, her cries echoing across the stone buildings. Some witnesses would later claim they heard him weeping. Others said they saw him turn away when her screams became too much to bear. But a few noticed something else entirely, a look in his eyes that they had never seen before. Something cold, something broken, something hungry. When Joan's voice finally fell silent and the flames began to die, Gilles de Rais mounted his horse and rode away from Rouen without speaking to anyone. He didn't return to court. He didn't seek an audience with the king. Instead, he rode directly to his estates in Brittany and locked himself away in his castle for months. The Golden Knight of France had vanished, and what emerged from that self-imposed exile was something altogether different. The changes began subtly. Gilles' servants noticed that their master no longer attended morning prayers. His chaplain reported that he had stopped requesting private masses. Instead, he spent his days in his library, poring over books that arrived in unmarked packages from distant lands. Texts on alchemy, treatises on the summoning of spirits, forbidden knowledge that the church condemned as heretical. But it was the theatrical productions that truly alarmed those around him. Gilles began staging elaborate mystery plays in his great hall, performances that cost more than most nobles spent in a year. He hired dozens of actors, musicians, and craftsmen to create spectacles of stunning beauty and terrifying darkness. These weren't the simple religious pageants common to medieval courts. These were elaborate, almost hypnotic productions that seemed to blur the line between performance and ritual. The plays always featured the same themes: innocence corrupted, trust betrayed, and the transformation of good into evil. Gilles himself often took starring roles, portraying fallen angels, corrupted kings, or noble knights who discovered dark powers. He would perform with an intensity that left audiences uncomfortable, as if he weren't acting at all, but revealing something genuine and disturbing about his inner nature. His spending became reckless, even by the standards of medieval nobility. He was burning through his vast fortune at an alarming rate, commissioning golden chalices, jeweled daggers, and ornate furnishings that served no practical purpose. But strangest of all were the private chambers he ordered, constructed in the depths of his castles. Rooms with no windows, accessible only through hidden passages, equipped with strange apparatus that his servants weren't allowed to examine. Meanwhile, his public appearances grew increasingly rare and unsettling. When he did attend court functions, nobles noticed that something fundamental had changed about Gilles de Rais. The righteous fire in his eyes had been replaced by something colder and more calculating. His famous generosity now carried an undertone of expectation, as if he were keeping track of debts that others didn't even know they owed. And there were the questions. Casual inquiries about families in his territories, particularly those with young children who might be in need of employment or education. Local priests began to report strange requests from the marshal's representatives. They wanted information about orphans, about families struggling with poverty, about children who might benefit from opportunities at the great lord's estates. The Golden Knight had died in the flames at Rouen, along with his beloved Joan. What had taken his place was something else entirely. Something that smiled with his face, spoke with his voice, and moved through the world wearing his reputation like a perfectly fitted mask. And in the villages surrounding his estates, families were about to discover just how dangerous that mask could be, because the thing that had been born from Gilles de Rais' grief wasn't content with books and plays and golden trinkets. It was hungry for something far more precious, something that could only be found in the most innocent and defenseless corners of his domain. The transformation was complete. Now the feeding could begin. Chapter 3: The Harvest of Innocence. The first child to vanish was a peasant boy named Joan, 12 years old, from a family so poor they could barely afford to feed him. When a well-dressed servant appeared at their cottage door in the spring of 1433, offering the boy employment at the great marshal's castle, his parents wept with gratitude. Their son would have food, shelter, and the chance to learn a trade in service to France's greatest war hero. They kissed Joan goodbye and watched him ride away behind the servant's horse, never knowing they would never see their child alive again. Within weeks, similar scenes were playing out across the countryside surrounding Gilles de Rais' estates. Well-spoken representatives would arrive at the humblest cottages with the same generous offer: employment for young boys at the marshal's castles. They targeted families with surgical precision, those with too many mouths to feed, those struggling with debts, those who could not afford to refuse such an opportunity. The servants always emphasized the marshal's kindness, his reputation for taking care of his people, his desire to educate and elevate deserving children. At first, no one connected these disappearances to anything sinister. In medieval times, it was common for noble households to employ large numbers of servants, and many families considered it a blessing when their children were offered positions in great houses. The servants who made these offers were polite, well-dressed, and carried papers bearing the marshal's official seal. Everything appeared legitimate, even generous. But as months passed, disturbing patterns began to emerge. The children who went to serve Gilles de Rais never returned home for visits. They never sent messages to their families. When desperate parents made the difficult journey to his castles to inquire about their sons, they were turned away by guards who claimed no knowledge of any such children. The boys had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Local clergy began to receive increasingly frantic visits from grieving families. Mothers spoke of dreams where their children called out for help. Fathers described a feeling of wrongness they couldn't explain, a certainty that their sons were in terrible danger. But what could they do? These were peasants confronting one of the most powerful nobles in France. Their word meant nothing against his reputation. The hunting expeditions became more frequent and more organized. Gilles' servants, particularly his valets, Henriet, Griard, and Poitou, developed an efficient system for identifying and acquiring suitable targets. They would visit markets and festivals, looking for children who fit their master's specific requirements, young boys, typically between 8 and 15 years old, preferably from families with no powerful connections. They carried purses full of silver coins and letters of introduction that opened doors throughout the region. Sometimes they didn't even bother with elaborate pretenses. In more remote areas, children would simply disappear while playing in fields or walking along country roads. Local authorities, when they investigated at all, assumed these were cases of wolves, bandits, or simple accidents. The idea that France's most celebrated war hero might be involved in such disappearances was literally unthinkable. But within the walls of his castles, a different reality was taking shape. Servants began to notice strange sounds echoing from the sealed chambers their master had constructed. Sounds that seemed almost like crying, but which they were strictly forbidden to investigate. They observed their lord's increasingly erratic behavior, his obsession with privacy, his rage when anyone ventured too close to certain parts of his domain. New rules were established. Specific areas of the castles were declared off-limits to all but a select few. Questions about the missing children were met with harsh punishment. The most loyal servants, those who had served the family for generations, found themselves reassigned or dismissed entirely. In their place came a new breed of attendant, men who asked no questions, who carried out orders without hesitation, and who seemed to share their master's developing appetite for secrecy and darkness. These weren't typical household servants. These were accomplices, hand-picked for their willingness to participate in activities that would have horrified ordinary people. Among the local population, whispers began to spread. Families shared stories of children who had vanished after receiving job offers from the marshal's representatives. Merchants reported seeing groups of young boys being escorted toward his estates, but never seeing them again. Hunters claimed to smell strange smoke rising from the chimneys of his castles at odd hours, smoke that carried an unsettling scent they couldn't identify. Yet even as suspicions grew, no one dared voice them openly. This was Gilles de Rais, the savior of France, the companion of saints. To accuse such a man of wrongdoing without absolute proof would be not just dangerous, but potentially heretical. The common people learned to speak of their missing children in whispers, if they spoke of them at all. By late 1434, the disappearances had become so frequent that entire villages lived in fear. Parents kept their children close to home. Mothers warned their sons never to speak to well-dressed strangers. But the predators had become too skilled, too organized, and far too confident. They knew that their master's reputation was better than any armor, his political connections more valuable than any weapon. What none of these terrified families could have imagined was the true scope of what was happening within those sealed chambers. The reality was so much worse than their darkest nightmares could have conceived, because Gilles de Rais hadn't just developed a taste for making children disappear. He had discovered appetites that would have shocked the demons of hell themselves. And this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 4. The Chamber of Ultimate Horror. What happened within the sealed chambers of Gilles de Rais' castles was so unspeakably evil that when the truth finally emerged, it would shock even the battle-hardened judges of medieval France. The children who disappeared into those stone walls didn't simply meet their end. They were subjected to torments that defied human comprehension, orchestrated by a man who had once been their kingdom's greatest protector. The routine was always the same. When a child arrived at one of his estates, they would initially be treated with surprising kindness. Gilles understood the psychology of trust, and he was a master of manipulation. The children were given good food, clean clothes, and comfortable lodging. They were told they were special, chosen for important work that would make their families proud. This period of false comfort could last days or even weeks, allowing the children to believe they had truly found salvation from their previous lives of poverty and hardship. But this kindness was nothing more than a predator's calculated preparation. Gilles was studying his victims, learning their fears, their hopes, their breaking points. He was also savoring the anticipation, drawing out the psychological torment that would precede the physical horror to come. The children had no idea they were living in the calm before an unimaginable storm. When Gilles finally revealed his true nature, the transformation was swift and terrifying. Historical records from his eventual trial describe acts of such systematic cruelty that medieval chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to record them. The children were subjected to forms of suffering that combined physical torment with psychological torture, designed not just to cause pain, but to break their spirits entirely before their lives ended. Witnesses who later testified against him described hearing sounds from the sealed chambers that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Cries for help that would suddenly be cut short, followed by periods of terrible silence. They spoke of strange rituals conducted at odd hours, of their master emerging from these sessions in a state of euphoric satisfaction that made their blood run cold. They described the disposal of evidence in the dead of night, the burning of materials that filled the air with smoke so foul it made grown men physically ill. What made these crimes even more monstrous was their ritualistic nature. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. Gilles had developed elaborate ceremonies around his acts of cruelty, viewing them as essential components of his descent into dark arts and forbidden knowledge. He believed that the suffering of innocents could grant him supernatural powers, that their life force could be harvested and used to fuel his experiments in alchemy and demon summoning. His accomplices later revealed that he would often speak to his victims during their ordeal, explaining his theories about the transfer of spiritual energy from the pure to the corrupt. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a scholar of the darkest arts, conducting experiments that required the ultimate sacrifice of those who possessed what he had lost: innocence, purity, and hope. The disposal of evidence became an art form in itself. Bodies were burned in specially constructed furnaces that had been built into the foundations of his castles. Ashes were scattered in remote locations or mixed into mortar for construction projects. Clothing and personal effects were destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remained. Gilles had learned to make children vanish, not just from life, but from history itself. Perhaps most chilling of all was his emotional detachment during these acts. Witnesses described him as calm, almost scholarly in his approach to inflicting suffering. He would pause to take notes, to observe reactions, to adjust his methods for maximum effect. This wasn't the work of a man consumed by uncontrollable rage or madness. This was the methodical behavior of someone who had consciously chosen to become something inhuman. The psychological impact on his accomplices was devastating. Several of his servants who participated in these crimes would later describe nightmares that plagued them for years. They spoke of being unable to look at children without feeling sick, of hearing phantom cries in empty rooms, of a constant sense that they were being watched by the spirits of the dead. Yet none of them found the courage to speak out while the crimes were occurring, held silent by a combination of fear, complicity, and the knowledge that no one would believe such accusations against France's greatest hero. As the years passed, Gilles' appetite for these dark rituals only grew stronger. What had begun as occasional acts of violence became a regular pattern of systematic cruelty. He developed preferences, techniques, and elaborate justifications for increasingly horrific behavior. The man who had once charged into battle to save innocent lives was now dedicating his existence to destroying them in the most terrible ways imaginable. But even as he descended deeper into this nightmare of his own creation, Gilles de Rais continued to maintain his public facade. He still attended court functions, still received honors for his past military service, still carried himself with the bearing of a noble knight. The disconnect between his public reputation and his private reality had become so complete that he seemed to be living in two entirely different worlds simultaneously. What his victims experienced in those final moments, history can only imagine. But the terror they must have felt upon realizing that their salvation had become their damnation, that the great hero they had trusted was actually a monster beyond their worst nightmares, represents one of the most profound betrayals in human history. And still, the worst revelation was yet to come, because what the world didn't know was that this wasn't the work of one man acting alone. Gilles de Rais had built an entire network of evil, a carefully organized system designed to feed his monstrous appetites while maintaining perfect secrecy. The scope of this conspiracy would ultimately prove to be even more shocking than the crimes themselves. Chapter 5. The Network of Evil. The most terrifying aspect of Gilles de Rais' reign of horror wasn't just the scale of his crimes. It was how many people he convinced to help him commit them. What emerged during his eventual trial was evidence of a carefully constructed conspiracy that reached into every level of his household and beyond. This wasn't the work of a lone madman. This was an organized operation that required dozens of accomplices, each playing their role in a nightmare that had consumed an entire region of France. At the center of this web of corruption were his most trusted servants, men who had transformed from loyal retainers into active participants in unspeakable acts. Henriette Griard, his personal valet, had become the primary recruiter of victims. Witnesses described him as charming and persuasive, capable of convincing desperate families that sending their children to serve the marshal was the opportunity of a lifetime. But behind his friendly demeanor was a predator who had learned to identify vulnerable targets with deadly precision. Poitou, another valet, served as the organizer of logistics. He managed the transportation of children to various castles, ensured that evidence was properly destroyed, and maintained the complex schedules that allowed his master to pursue his dark interests without detection. Court records reveal that he had developed elaborate systems for tracking victims, managing alibis, and coordinating the disposal of remains. His attention to detail was so meticulous that the conspiracy operated for years without leaving obvious traces. But perhaps most disturbing was the role of Eustache Blanchet, a priest who had become Gilles' spiritual advisor in matters of the occult. Rather than providing moral guidance that might have prevented these atrocities, Blanchet actively encouraged his master's descent into darkness. He provided religious justifications for the crimes, conducted perverted ceremonies that blessed these acts of evil, and helped recruit other clergy members who could be corrupted or coerced into silence. The network extended far beyond the immediate household staff. Local magistrates were bribed to ignore reports of missing children. Regional officials were convinced that any investigations might embarrass the crown by implicating one of its most celebrated heroes. Merchants were paid handsomely to provide specialized equipment and materials needed for the crimes and their cover-up. Even some members of the church hierarchy were either directly involved or willfully blind to what was happening in their territories. Most shocking of all was the recruitment of François Prelati, an Italian conjurer who became Gilles' partner in exploring the darkest aspects of medieval occultism. Prelati convinced his patron that the suffering of innocents could be used to summon demons, transmute base metals into gold, and unlock supernatural powers that would make him invincible. Under Prelati's guidance, the random acts of violence evolved into elaborate rituals designed to harvest what they believed to be the spiritual essence of their victims. These rituals became increasingly complex and horrifying. Participants described ceremonies conducted in specially prepared chambers, decorated with symbols that had been copied from forbidden texts. They spoke of incantations performed while children suffered, of attempts to communicate with demonic entities that supposedly fed on terror and pain. What had begun as the crimes of a disturbed individual had evolved into a systematic exploration of ultimate evil, dressed up in the language of medieval mysticism. The psychological hold that Gilles exercised over his accomplices was perhaps his most diabolic achievement. He convinced ordinary servants that they were participating in something historically significant, that their actions were justified by higher purposes that common minds couldn't understand. He used a combination of financial incentives, intellectual seduction, and carefully applied terror to transform decent people into willing participants in monstrous acts. Some accomplices were motivated by greed. Gilles paid extremely well for absolute loyalty and silence. Others were driven by fear, having witnessed enough of their master's capabilities to understand the consequences of betrayal. But the most disturbing cases were those who seemed to be genuinely convinced by his twisted philosophy, servants who had been so completely corrupted that they actually believed their actions were serving some greater cosmic purpose. The recruitment process for new accomplices was itself a masterpiece of manipulation. Gilles would identify servants who showed particular loyalty or desperation, then gradually expose them to increasingly compromising activities. By the time they understood the full scope of what they were involved in, they were already so deeply implicated that escape seemed impossible. They had become prisoners of their own complicity, trapped in a nightmare they had helped to create. Communication between different elements of the network was managed through coded messages and carefully scheduled meetings. Different accomplices were given only the information they needed for their specific roles, ensuring that no single individual outside of Gilles himself understood the complete scope of the operation. This compartmentalization made detection nearly impossible and ensured that even if one element of the conspiracy was discovered, the rest could continue operating. The most chilling aspect of this network was how normal it appeared from the outside. To casual observers, these were simply the household staff of a great noble, going about their daily duties in service to one of France's most respected figures. The horror was hidden beneath layers of routine activity, bureaucratic procedures, and social expectations that made the truth literally unthinkable to outsiders. But every network has its weaknesses, and this one was built on a foundation of fear, greed, and guilty knowledge that could never remain stable forever. As the years passed and the crimes multiplied, the psychological pressure on the accomplices began to take its toll. Nightmares, paranoia, and crushing guilt started to erode the bonds that held the conspiracy together. And when the end finally came, it wouldn't be the result of brilliant detective work or moral outrage. It would be caused by the one thing that Gilles de Rais had never learned to control: his own arrogance. The master manipulator was about to make a mistake so spectacular that it would bring his entire house of horrors crashing down around him. Chapter 6: The Unraveling. By the autumn of 1440, Gilles de Rais had become so confident in his invincibility that he believed himself above all earthly law. For nearly a decade, he had committed the most heinous crimes imaginable while maintaining his reputation as a war hero and noble knight. He had corrupted dozens of accomplices, silenced countless witnesses, and made hundreds of children vanish without consequence. In his mind, he had achieved something approaching godlike status, untouchable, unstoppable, and free to indulge any appetite, no matter how monstrous. This hubris would prove to be his fatal flaw. Because on September 15th, 1440, the man who had gotten away with mass slaughter for years would finally be brought down by the most mundane of disputes, a disagreement over property taxes and church jurisdiction that had nothing whatsoever to do with his secret crimes. The incident began with a petty financial quarrel involving the Church of Saint-Étienne de Mer-Morte in Machecoul. Gilles claimed ownership of the property and its revenues, but the local bishop had appointed a new priest, Jean Le Ferron, to administer the church and collect its tithes. What should have been resolved through normal legal channels instead triggered an explosion of rage that revealed just how unstable the marshal had become after years of living his double life. Rather than accepting the bishop's decision or pursuing the matter through proper ecclesiastical courts, Gilles decided to settle the dispute through direct action. On a quiet Sunday morning, while the congregation was attending Mass, he led a group of armed men into the church itself. In full view of terrified worshippers, they seized priest Le Ferron during the holy service, binding him with ropes and dragging him from the altar like a common criminal. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was sacrilege of the highest order. Gilles had violated the sanctuary of a church, assaulted a consecrated priest during Mass, and committed these acts in front of dozens of witnesses who could never be silenced or intimidated. For a man whose entire criminal enterprise depended on secrecy and his untouchable reputation, it was an act of staggering stupidity. The reaction was swift and decisive. Bishop Malestroit of Nantes, who had jurisdiction over the violated church, immediately filed formal charges against Gilles de Rais for sacrilege, violence against the clergy, and violation of ecclesiastical sanctuary. These weren't accusations that could be dismissed through political connections or intimidation. They were crimes against the church itself, and they demanded immediate investigation and punishment. What made Gilles' situation even worse was the timing. King Charles VII, the same monarch whose crown Gilles had helped secure alongside Joan of Arc, was facing increasing pressure from the church to demonstrate his piety and respect for ecclesiastical authority. The last thing he needed was a scandal involving one of his most prominent nobles, openly defying church law. Rather than protecting his former ally, the king gave his tacit approval for a full investigation into Gilles' conduct. As church authorities began examining the circumstances surrounding the assault on priest Le Ferron, they quickly discovered that local populations had been harboring suspicions about the marshal for years. Suddenly, people who had been too frightened to speak openly about missing children found the courage to approach church officials with their concerns. Families who had lost sons to mysterious job offers began sharing their stories. Servants who had witnessed strange activities at Gilles' castles started whispering about what they had seen and heard. The investigation that had begun with a simple case of assault on a priest was rapidly expanding into something far more serious. Church inquisitors, experienced in uncovering hidden truths and trained to recognize deception, began conducting systematic interviews with anyone who had connections to Gilles' household. Unlike secular authorities who might be influenced by political considerations, these ecclesiastical investigators answered only to God and church law. What they discovered horrified even these experienced inquisitors. Pattern after pattern emerged from witness testimony. Children who had vanished after contact with Gilles' representatives, servants who described horrifying sounds and smells from sealed chambers, local officials who had been bribed or intimidated into ignoring obvious signs of criminal activity. The scope of the conspiracy became clear, and with it, the realization that they were dealing with crimes far beyond simple assault on a priest. By October of 1440, just weeks after the church incident, formal charges were being prepared against Gilles de Rais for crimes that would have been unthinkable to attribute to any other member of medieval nobility. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic atrocities that made the original assault charge seem trivial by comparison. The man who had believed himself untouchable was about to face the full weight of medieval justice. But even as the walls closed around him, Gilles seemed incapable of grasping the severity of his situation. His arrogance had become so complete that he actually believed he could talk his way out of these charges, that his reputation and political connections would protect him even from accusations of the most heinous crimes imaginable. He had spent so many years successfully maintaining his double life that he had forgotten the most basic rule of criminal conspiracy. The bigger the secret, the harder it becomes to keep. The master manipulator was about to discover that all his skills at deception, all his wealth and influence, all his carefully constructed networks of corruption meant nothing when faced with the determination of investigators who served a higher authority than any earthly power. His reign of terror was coming to an end, and the reckoning would be more terrible than anything he had ever inflicted on his victims. The monster was finally going to face judgment, and the world was about to learn just how deep his evil had really gone. Chapter 7. The Trial That Horrified Europe. October 13th, 1440. The great hall of Nantes Castle had been transformed into a courtroom, unlike any in medieval history. Two separate tribunals sat in judgment, an ecclesiastical court led by Bishop Malstroit to address crimes against church law, and a civil court representing the Duke of Brittany to handle secular offences. Never before had such a prominent figure faced such serious charges in such a public forum. The entire structure of medieval justice was being tested by accusations so monstrous that many still struggled to believe they could be true. Gilles de Rais entered the courtroom with his characteristic arrogance intact, apparently convinced that his reputation would shield him from serious consequences. He was still dressed in the finest clothes, still carried himself with noble bearing, still seemed to believe that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved in his favor. But as the formal charges were read aloud, something in his expression began to change. The initial accusations were serious enough: sacrilege, assault on clergy, violation of church sanctuary. These crimes alone carried severe penalties, including potential excommunication and loss of noble titles. But then the court officials continued reading, and the true scope of the investigation became clear. Charges of heresy, charges of practicing forbidden arts, charges of corruption of minors, and finally, the accusation that would echo through history, charges involving the disappearance and alleged destruction of hundreds of innocent children. The prosecution had assembled a case that was overwhelming in both scope and detail. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about missing children, strange activities at Gilles' castles, and the systematic pattern of recruitment and disappearance that had terrorized the region for years. Local priests described families torn apart by unexplained losses. Merchants testified about unusual purchases of specialized equipment. Even some of Gilles' own servants, granted immunity in exchange for their testimony, began to reveal the horrifying truth about what had been happening behind the walls of his estates. But the most damaging testimony came from his closest accomplices, the men who had been integral to his network of corruption. Henriette Griard, his trusted valet and primary recruiter of victims, provided detailed accounts of how children were selected, transported, and delivered to his master. His testimony was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly damning, describing a system of organized evil that had operated with terrifying efficiency for nearly a decade. Poitou, the other valet, corroborated every detail of Griard's testimony while adding horrifying specifics about the disposal of evidence and the maintenance of secrecy. He described the specially constructed furnaces, the carefully planned schedules, the elaborate precautions taken to ensure that no trace of the crimes would ever be discovered. His matter-of-fact delivery of these devastating details shocked the court into stunned silence. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the testimony of François Prelati, the Italian conjurer who had guided Gilles deeper into the world of occult practices. Prelati described rituals that combined the worst elements of medieval superstition with genuine acts of cruelty, ceremonies designed to harvest what they believed to be supernatural power from the suffering of innocents. His testimony revealed that these weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned rituals with specific purposes and elaborate justifications. As the evidence mounted, something extraordinary happened in the courtroom. Gilles de Rais, who had maintained his innocence and dignity throughout the early proceedings, suddenly broke down completely. The weight of the testimony, the detail of the accusations, and perhaps the realization that his carefully constructed world of deception was crumbling around him finally shattered his psychological defenses. What happened next shocked even the experienced judges and court officials. Rather than continuing to proclaim his innocence, Gilles began to confess. But these weren't simple admissions of guilt. They were detailed, emotional, and horrifyingly comprehensive accounts of crimes that surpassed even the prosecution's accusations. He described his methods, his motivations, his psychological state during the commission of these acts, and his twisted justifications for behavior that defied rational explanation. The confessions came in waves, each more disturbing than the last. Historical records describe judges struggling to maintain their composure as they listened to admissions that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature. Court scribes found themselves unable to record certain details, either from horror at their content or from concern about preserving such information for posterity. But what made these confessions even more unsettling was Gilles' emotional state during their delivery. He wept openly, not from remorse for his victims, but from what appeared to be self-pity at being caught. He seemed more concerned about his reputation and legacy than about the hundreds of lives he had destroyed. His tears were for himself, not for the children whose suffering he described in such clinical detail. The testimony revealed the full scope of his network of corruption, implicating dozens of accomplices and revealing a conspiracy that had reached into every level of regional society. Names were named, methods were detailed, and the systematic nature of the crimes became undeniably clear. What had begun as an investigation into assault on a priest had uncovered what may have been the most extensive criminal enterprise in medieval European history. As the trial progressed, news of the proceedings spread throughout Europe. Noble courts from England to Italy followed the developments with horrified fascination. The idea that one of France's greatest heroes could be guilty of such monstrous acts challenged fundamental assumptions about nobility, heroism, and human nature itself. Letters and reports describing the testimony circulated among the educated classes, creating a sensation that transcended national boundaries. The judges faced an unprecedented situation. Never before had they dealt with crimes of such magnitude committed by someone of such prominence. Medieval justice was designed to handle disputes between nobles, crimes of passion, and violations of feudal law. It wasn't equipped to process systematic atrocities that seemed to belong more to nightmares than to reality. By the end of October, the evidence against Gilles de Rais had become so overwhelming that even his most powerful political allies abandoned him. The king, who had once celebrated him as a hero, now wanted nothing more than to distance the crown from the growing scandal. Church authorities, initially cautious about pursuing such serious charges against a prominent noble, now demanded the harshest possible penalties. The trial that had begun as a relatively simple case of ecclesiastical assault had evolved into something far more significant, a confrontation between medieval society and evil in its purest form. And as the proceedings moved toward their inevitable conclusion, everyone involved understood that they were witnessing something that would be remembered for centuries to come. The hero of France was about to be revealed as its greatest monster, and the judgment that awaited him would be as merciless as the crimes he had committed. Chapter 8. The Final Confession. As October drew to a close, the courtroom in Nantes had become a theater of psychological horror unlike anything medieval Europe had ever witnessed. The evidence against Gilles de Rais was already overwhelming. His accomplices had provided devastating testimony, and his guilt was beyond reasonable doubt. But what happened next would transform this trial from a simple criminal proceeding into one of the most chilling documents in human history, a window into the mind of absolute evil. On October 21st, 1440, something extraordinary occurred. Gilles de Rais, who had initially maintained his innocence with aristocratic dignity, suffered what can only be described as a complete psychological collapse. The carefully constructed facade that had protected him for so many years finally cracked under the weight of irrefutable evidence and the realization that his world of deception was crumbling beyond repair. What followed was not just an admission of guilt, but a series of confessions so detailed, so emotionally raw, and so comprehensively horrifying that they left the medieval judges struggling to maintain their composure. These weren't the calculated statements of a man trying to minimize his punishment. They were the desperate outpourings of someone whose psychological defenses had been completely shattered. The first confession began with tears. Gilles wept openly in the courtroom, but as his testimony continued, it became clear that these weren't tears of remorse for his victims. They were tears of self-pity, of regret at being caught, of anguish at the destruction of his reputation, rather than sorrow for the lives he had destroyed. This emotional display, far from generating sympathy, actually made his admissions more disturbing to those who witnessed them. He described his descent into evil with a chilling combination of clinical detachment and emotional intensity. He spoke of the moment after Joan of Arc's death when something inside him had broken permanently, creating an emptiness that could only be filled through the suffering of others. He detailed his early experiments with forbidden knowledge, his gradual corruption of loyal servants, and his development of the systematic methods that had allowed him to operate undetected for so many years. But it was his description of the victims that truly horrified the court. Gilles spoke about the children with a disturbing mixture of contempt and fascination, describing them not as human beings, but as raw materials for his twisted experiments. He detailed his methods of selection, his techniques for gaining their trust, and his elaborate preparations for what he euphemistically called his ceremonies. The psychological insight these confessions provided into his mindset was perhaps more terrifying than the crimes themselves. They revealed a man who had consciously chosen to abandon every principle of human decency, who had methodically transformed himself into something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal moral understanding. He hadn't been driven to these acts by madness or uncontrollable impulses. He had embraced evil as a philosophical choice. Most disturbing of all was his attempt to justify his actions through twisted theological arguments. He claimed that his victims had achieved a kind of spiritual elevation through their suffering, that their deaths had served purposes beyond ordinary human comprehension, that he had actually done them a favor by selecting them for his rituals. These weren't the ravings of a madman, but the calculated rationalization of someone who had spent years developing a coherent philosophy of evil. The judges found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Medieval justice was accustomed to dealing with crimes of passion, disputes over property, and violations of feudal obligations. But Gilles de Rais had committed acts that seemed to belong to a different category entirely, systematic atrocities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the limits of moral corruption. His confessions continued over multiple sessions, each one revealing new depths of depravity that had previously been hidden. He described the physical layout of his torture chambers with architectural precision, the specialized tools he had commissioned for his purposes, and the elaborate rituals he had developed to maximize both the suffering of his victims and his own psychological satisfaction from their pain. Perhaps most chilling was his description of his emotional state during the commission of these crimes. He spoke of a sense of power and transcendence that he experienced while inflicting suffering, a feeling of having moved beyond ordinary human limitations into a realm where normal moral constraints no longer applied. He described these moments with an intensity that made clear they represented the most meaningful experiences of his life. The court also learned about the extent of his occult practices, his belief that the blood of innocents could unlock supernatural powers, and his elaborate attempts to communicate with demonic entities that he believed were guiding his actions. These revelations added a dimension of heretical blasphemy to crimes that were already beyond the scope of ordinary criminal law. What made these confessions even more disturbing was their internal consistency and attention to detail. This wasn't the testimony of someone trying to avoid responsibility or minimize his guilt. It was the comprehensive account of someone who seemed almost proud of what he had accomplished, someone who wanted the world to understand the full scope of his achievements in the realm of absolute evil. The psychological impact on everyone present was devastating. Court officials who had heard testimony about every conceivable form of medieval crime found themselves physically ill after listening to Gilles' detailed admissions. Even the experienced ecclesiastical judges, trained to confront the darkest aspects of human sinfulness, struggled to process revelations that seemed to come from beyond the normal boundaries of human wickedness. By the time his confessions were complete, Gilles de Rais had provided a roadmap to evil so comprehensive that it would influence discussions about the nature of human wickedness for centuries to come. He had revealed not just what he had done, but why he had done it, how he had justified it to himself, and what psychological satisfaction he had derived from acts that normal minds could barely comprehend. The Golden Knight, who had once saved France alongside Joan of Arc, had transformed himself into something that medieval Christianity could only understand as a living embodiment of the devil himself. And now, having revealed the full extent of his corruption, he faced a judgment that would be as absolute and merciless as the evil he had chosen to embrace. The time for mercy had passed. The time for justice had come. Chapter 9. The Execution of a Demon. October 26, 1440. Dawn broke grey and cold over the city of Nantes as thousands of people gathered in the fields beyond the city walls. Word had spread throughout France, and beyond that, Gilles de Rais, the once celebrated hero of the realm, would face his final judgment this day. The crowd that assembled was unlike any that had gathered for a medieval execution. Nobles and peasants, clergy and merchants, all united by a morbid fascination with witnessing the end of a man who had embodied both ultimate heroism and absolute evil. The formal sentencing had been delivered 3 days earlier with a solemnity befitting the magnitude of his crimes. Both the ecclesiastical and civil courts had reached identical conclusions. Gilles de Rais was guilty of heresy, sacrilege, sodomy, and the systematic destruction of innocent life on a scale that defied comprehension. The sentences were equally unanimous: death by hanging, followed by burning, with his body to be consumed completely so that no trace of his physical presence would remain to contaminate the earth. But in a final twist that demonstrated the complex nature of medieval justice, the Church had granted him one last mercy. Because of his comprehensive confessions and apparent repentance, though many questioned the sincerity of his remorse, his body would be removed from the flames before being completely consumed, allowing for Christian burial rather than the total destruction typically reserved for heretics. Even in the face of unimaginable evil, the medieval world struggled to abandon entirely the possibility of redemption. As the morning progressed, Gilles was brought from his cell in Nantes Castle to face his final moments. Those who witnessed his final journey described a man who seemed to have aged decades in the weeks since his arrest. The arrogant nobleman who had entered the courtroom believing himself untouchable had been replaced by someone who appeared broken, diminished, and finally aware of the true magnitude of what he had done. The execution site had been carefully prepared for an event that everyone understood would be remembered for centuries. A high scaffold had been constructed to ensure that the entire crowd could witness the proceedings. The gibbet stood stark against the grey sky, a symbol of final justice that had been delayed for far too long. Nearby, the execution pyre waited with carefully stacked wood that would ensure the flames burned hot and fast. The crowd's reaction as Gilles appeared was complex and disturbing. There were no cheers for justice, no calls for vengeance, only an eerie silence that reflected the profound unease everyone felt at witnessing the end of someone who had been both their greatest hero and their most terrible nightmare. Many in the crowd had lost children to his crimes, yet they had also celebrated his military victories. The psychological conflict of seeing their savior revealed as their destroyer created an atmosphere of surreal tension. Gilles was accompanied to the scaffold by several priests who had spent the previous days attempting to prepare his soul for whatever judgment awaited him in the afterlife. Their faces revealed the strain of trying to provide spiritual comfort to someone whose crimes seemed to place him beyond the normal boundaries of Christian forgiveness. Yet they persisted in their duties, driven by the belief that even the most corrupt soul might find redemption in its final moments. As he mounted the scaffold, Gilles addressed the crowd in a voice that those present described as surprisingly strong and clear. His final words were carefully recorded by court scribes, creating a document that would be studied by theologians and legal scholars for generations to come. He spoke of his crimes with apparent remorse, warning others against the path he had chosen and asking forgiveness from the families whose children he had destroyed. But even in these final moments, something about his demeanor troubled those who witnessed it. His confession seemed rehearsed, his remorse calculated rather than genuine. Some observers noted that he appeared more concerned with his legacy and reputation than with the suffering he had caused. Others detected a note of pride in his voice as he described the magnitude of his crimes, as if he remained impressed by his own capacity for evil even as he faced its consequences. The execution itself was carried out with the efficiency typical of medieval justice. The hanging was swift and professionally administered, designed to minimize suffering while ensuring that justice was clearly seen to be done. As his body went limp, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled crowd, not satisfaction at vengeance achieved, but relief that this particular nightmare had finally ended. But the most disturbing moment came as his body was lowered from the gibbet and placed on the waiting pyre. As the flames began to consume the physical form of France's most notorious criminal, several witnesses reported seeing something that they struggled to describe or explain. Some claimed they saw strange shadows dancing in the smoke. Others spoke of unnatural sounds that seemed to come from the fire itself. While these accounts can be dismissed as the products of overwrought imaginations, they reflect the psychological impact that Gilles de Rais had on everyone who encountered his story. True to the court's sentence, his body was removed from the flames before being completely consumed, allowing for burial in consecrated ground at the nearby church of Notre-Dame de Carme. Even in death, the medieval world couldn't quite decide how to treat someone who had embodied such contradictions. Hero and monster, saint's companion and devil's servant, France's savior and its greatest destroyer of innocence. The crowd dispersed slowly, many seeming reluctant to leave the site where they had witnessed the end of one of history's most complex and terrifying figures. Conversations were muted, filled with attempts to process what they had seen and what it meant for their understanding of human nature itself. Parents held their children closer, nobles questioned their assumptions about honor and breeding, and priests struggled with theological questions about the nature of evil and redemption. As night fell over the execution site, only the dying embers of the pyre remained to mark where Gilles de Rais had met his end. The physical presence of France's most notorious criminal had been removed from the world, but his psychological legacy would prove far more difficult to extinguish. The questions his crimes had raised about the nature of trust, the reliability of reputation, and the depths of human corruption would haunt European consciousness for generations to come. The monster was dead, but the nightmare he had created was only beginning to spread its influence through the darker corners of human imagination, and the most chilling realization of all was yet to come. The understanding that if Gilles de Rais could hide such monstrous evil behind such a perfect facade, then anyone could. The age of innocence was over. The age of suspicion had begun. Chapter 10, The Legacy of the Monster. The death of Gilles de Rais should have marked the end of his story, but in many ways it was only the beginning. As news of his crimes spread throughout medieval Europe and beyond, his case began to influence human consciousness in ways that would echo through the centuries. The man who had once been celebrated as the perfect knight had become something far more enduring and terrifying. A cautionary tale about the masks that evil can wear and the trust that monsters can exploit. Within months of his execution, the story of Gilles de Rais had evolved into something approaching legend. But unlike the heroic legends that had celebrated his military achievements, this new mythology focused on the psychological horror of his double life. The tale that emerged wasn't just about his crimes. It was about the fundamental uncertainty of human nature itself, the terrifying possibility that the people we trust most completely might be hiding the darkest secrets imaginable. The most immediate impact was on the families and communities that had suffered under his reign of terror. For the parents who had sent their children to what they believed was salvation, only to discover they had delivered them to damnation, the psychological trauma was devastating and permanent. These families had to live with the knowledge that their trust in authority, their faith in reputation, and their belief in the goodness of celebrated heroes had led directly to the destruction of their most precious possessions. But the influence of his story extended far beyond his immediate victims. Throughout France and across Europe, noble families began to view their own members with new suspicion. If Gilles de Rais could hide such monstrous appetites behind such a perfect facade, what other horrors might be concealed behind the masks of respectability? The medieval world's faith in the correlation between noble birth and noble character had been shaken to its foundations. The Church, too, was forced to grapple with theological questions that Gilles' crimes had raised. How could someone who had fought alongside a saint, who had been blessed by God with military victory, who had participated in what seemed like divine miracles, be capable of such systematic evil? The case challenged fundamental assumptions about divine favor, moral character, and the reliability of religious authority. Some theologians argued that Gilles had been possessed by demons after Joan's death, while others suggested that his evil had always existed, hidden beneath layers of deception. The legal implications were equally profound. Medieval justice had been designed to handle disputes between nobles, crimes of passion, and violations of feudal law. But Gilles de Rais had committed acts that existed in an entirely different category, systematic atrocities that required new frameworks for understanding and prosecution. His case became a precedent for dealing with crimes that seemed to transcend ordinary human wickedness, establishing legal principles that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Gilles de Rais began to influence popular culture in ways that would prove remarkably enduring. Within decades of his death, elements of his story had been incorporated into folk tales, ballads, and cautionary stories told around hearths throughout Europe. The narrative of a trusted authority figure who betrays that trust in the most horrifying way possible became a recurring theme in European folklore. Most famously, his story became one of the primary inspirations for the tale of Bluebeard, the legendary figure who murdered his wives and stored their bodies in a forbidden chamber. While the details were changed to make the story suitable for popular consumption, the psychological core remained the same: the horror of discovering that someone you trusted completely was actually a monster in disguise. This tale would eventually spread throughout the world, becoming one of the most enduring cautionary stories in human culture. The case also influenced the development of what would eventually become criminal psychology. Medieval scholars who studied his confessions and testimony were among the first to attempt systematic analysis of extreme criminal behavior. They tried to understand what combination of circumstances could transform a celebrated hero into history's most notorious child killer. Their primitive psychological theories would eventually evolve into modern criminology and forensic psychology. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Gilles de Rais was on the collective human psyche. His story introduced a new form of horror into popular consciousness. The terror of the trusted predator, the nightmare of discovering that salvation is actually damnation in disguise. This psychological template would resurface repeatedly throughout history, influencing literature, film, and popular culture in ways that continue to this day. Modern forensic experts who have studied his case recognize patterns that would be familiar to contemporary criminal profilers. His systematic approach to victim selection, his elaborate methods of maintaining secrecy, his psychological manipulation of accomplices, and his ability to compartmentalize his public and private personas all mark him as a prototype of the organized serial predator. In many ways, Gilles de Rais represents the first comprehensively documented case of what modern psychology would classify as a psychopathic serial killer. The numerical scope of his crimes remains a subject of historical debate, with estimates ranging from dozens to hundreds of victims. But the exact count is less important than the systematic nature of his activities and the length of time he was able to operate undetected. His case demonstrated that with sufficient social status, political connections, and psychological cunning, even the most monstrous predator could hide in plain sight for years. The most chilling aspect of his legacy is the question that his story raises about the nature of evil itself. Was Gilles de Rais a unique monster? A singular aberration whose crimes were so extraordinary that they could never be repeated? Or was he simply the first such predator to be comprehensively documented, a representative of a type of evil that has always existed but rarely been fully exposed to historical scrutiny? The evidence suggests the latter interpretation. Throughout history, there have been numerous cases of trusted authority figures who exploited that trust to commit horrific crimes against the vulnerable. The pattern that Gilles established, the respected public figure concealing monstrous private appetites, has been repeated countless times across cultures and centuries. In this sense, his true legacy isn't just the crimes he committed, but the template he provided for understanding how such crimes can be concealed, committed, and eventually exposed. Today, more than 5 centuries after his death, the story of Gilles de Rais continues to fascinate and horrify audiences worldwide. His case remains one of the most studied examples of criminal psychology, cited in textbooks, analyzed by experts, and referenced in discussions about the nature of evil. The questions his crimes raised about trust, authority, and the masks that monsters wear remain as relevant today as they were in medieval France. The ultimate horror of Gilles de Rais isn't just what he did, it's what he represents. He embodies the terrifying possibility that the people we trust most, the authorities we rely on for protection, the heroes we celebrate for their noble achievements, might be concealing appetites and intentions that would destroy us if we knew the truth. His legacy is a permanent reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of salvation itself. The savior of France became its greatest monster. And in doing so, he taught humanity a lesson about the nature of trust, authority, and evil that we can never afford to forget. His story stands as an eternal warning. The most dangerous predators are often those who wear the masks of our most trusted protectors. If this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing cases has left you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and authority, you're not alone. The story of Gilles de Rais continues to haunt historians and criminologists centuries after his death. If you want to explore more twisted tales from history's darkest corners, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Twisted Facts Vault. We delve into the forbidden stories that textbooks won't tell you, the ones that reveal the true nature of power, corruption, and the monsters who hide behind masks of respectability. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into history's most disturbing secrets, because the truth is always more terrifying than the legend.